welcome back to the next episode of our S4 Avant conversion project. If you're new to what we're doing, we are taking this broken S4 entirely apart, and then we're going to take all those pieces and jam them into my 2012 A4 wagon, or Avant, if you're not familiar with the Audi terminology. So we're still working on stripping the S4 down, so you can see there's no engine in it. We've got a lot of the drivetrain components out and into the other bay in the garage, so we can start staging those to go into the A4. I've been working on removing the last couple details to get the manual transmission pieces over. So I need to get the brake booster out, the clutch slave cylinder and master cylinder assembly, and then the pedal box and the shifter linkages. I got stuck on those. I've spent the last couple days on my back underneath the pedals trying to get them out, because there's a special Audi tool, of course, and eventually I ordered that. So in the meantime, while that's coming, I'm going to go over to the other bay and start working on tearing down the engine. We're going to be doing some maintenance and some service stuff, new clutch, new water pump, those kinds of things while it's out of the car. We're just going to take this opportunity to do it while it's easy. So I'll get started on that while we wait for the tool to come in. So let's get to it. So I started tearing down the engine. The big goal is to get the transmission off. So there's, 8 bolts all the way around the transmission that come out that separate it from the engine, along with a couple other little details. One thing you have to do to get the transmission off is rotate the crank so you can get to all 6 of the bolts that connect the flywheel to the flex plate. So what I'm going to do is pull spark plugs and coils so that it's easier to turn the engine over. So cylinder 2 on the driver's side is just covered in oil. This is a spark plug I just pulled out, just covered in corrosion, and the tip is all rusted over. Definitely not what you want to see, so I'm guessing these are pretty old, and it's a good thing we're changing them. Now I need to counterhold the crank pulley so I can get off the bolts that connect the flywheel to the flex plate. And apparently with this engine there's a specialty tool that I don't have. There isn't just a center bolt, so they've got some weird tool that kind of fits down in the cavity of the crank pulley. So I'm going to make up something to kind of match that and replicate how that works so we can get this off. Whipped this up pretty quickly. Definitely the best welds that you've seen on this channel so far. I sacrificed an old socket that I've got. I, for whatever reason, had multiples of this, so I figured it was the perfect opportunity. So this blade will go into the crank pulley, so you'll remove 2 bolts on either side of each other, and that'll create a slot. And then, this will go into that slot and counterhold the crank pulley against the other bolts. It's really hot right now still. I had the welder just set on full blast because this is some pretty thick stuff for what I've got. Apparently welding onto chromed sockets works reasonably well. We used the new tool. Faith held it over here on this end, and then I undid the bolts on the trans, and it worked pretty well, so happy with that. Definitely good welding, as always. So these are the bolts that came out. And now I just made up a little cardboard template that marks out which bolts go where so we can keep track of them. Now I'll start pulling out bolts from the trans. We undo the bottom ones first, and then we'll put the trans jack underneath, strap it on, undo the top ones, and then we can pull it off the engine. So now that the trans is precariously perched up on this crappy trans jack, we got to undo these little bolts on this retainer plate here, and then this whole axle actually pulls all the way out. So I pulled the clutch pack out of the transmission. It's pretty heavy, but it just slides right out. The inside of the trans is just covered in dust and grease, so it looks like somebody kind of burned out the clutch pretty badly. You can see by these adjustment springs that the clutch is pretty worn. This is the clutch pack. I took out all the bolts all the way around it. So there we go. So that's the pressure plate. This guy's definitely burning his clutch a lot. Here's our clutch disc. So I can pull this. Yeah, that's not the best looking clutch and flywheel I've ever seen. So this is our new replacement clutch disc. You can see it's got grooves all the way around that kind of separate the face into like miniature pucks. On the one that I pulled out, those grooves are pretty much worn all the way down. So we're getting close to the rivets. You probably won't be able to tell in the video, but the old clutch disc is about half the thickness of the new one. Little change of plans here. I decided to get a new flywheel because this one has some pretty bad heat scorching. I tried scuffing it up and you can actually feel the surface where the clutch disc is really burnt in. So I've dealt with loose, worn out flywheels before and it makes the car drive pretty clunky. So I figured, you know, why not spend some more money? So that's gonna come in a couple days. So for the meantime, we're gonna put the transmission aside and I'm gonna start working on getting the engine onto the engine stand. So I pulled the engine off the subframe. I made a little mistake. I forgot to reattach the chain on the hoist to a more spaced out, even distribution. Now that we don't have the transmission, so it lifted up and swung the engine pretty far forward. Now we're draining all this extra coolant out the supercharger. And now I've got the subframe back here. Probably gonna have to grab some help to get me off the hoist because it's pretty hefty. I've transferred the engine from the hoist over to the engine stand. This is something that I never enjoy doing just because it's a relatively cheap Harbor Freight engine stand and you never know. But it's fully supported by the stand now. So we can get the lift back, or the hoist, which we're gonna need once the A4 comes into the garage, so we can pull the engine subframe out of that. Definitely gonna do some service on the engine now. Gonna pull the oil pan, replace that. So I'm gonna start draining oil out the engine. This is something that we need to do to change the oil pan, obviously. And I probably should have put some gloves on, but you know how it is. There we go. Beautiful. The supercharger is all pretty much detached, so I've got 6 bolts along the sides. I'll pull those and then see what I missed, but got all this harness disconnected and we'll go from there. So that's the supercharger off. It's pretty hefty. Got it over here. It's a pretty cool unit. We can get into that later. So now I've got to pull off some stuff in here so we can get to the thermostat. I believe that's down in here somewhere. Probably, yeah, it's this piece. And then this will be the water pump on the front. So we're replacing both of those. So we'll pull that off next in preparation. I think those parts will be here tomorrow. The water pump is out. It's all pretty easy to get to when you are able to just work on the whole engine. So I've removed this hard pipe a little bit, and then here's our thermostat housing. So I'll pull that next and probably dump some more coolant on the floor because it's what my favorite pastime seems to be. There's not a whole lot I can do right now on the engine side of things until parts show up. I've got that pretty much stripped down. So I'm working on freeing up the manual transmission shifter assembly. So I've pulled off kind of the center console. We're inside the car. And if you've ever dealt with the B8, you know that they are classic for losing coins behind the ashtray. And this one is definitely no exception. I think there might be enough here to go get ourselves a Happy Meal at least. Shifter assembly is out. I've got this cubby just filled up with coins to go buy some cookies tonight or something with all that change. I also wanted to start installing more interior stuff. We've got all the door cards, but we got a real snowstorm today, and it's pretty gross and cold out now, so that's probably not going to happen just yet. So FCP definitely delivered. A little change of plans. Figured, well, it's this easily accessible, I'm going to try and do a little carbon cleaning. So I just finished up this side, and it really wasn't that bad. It looks like it's probably been cleaned before. I was expecting a little bit more buildup, but either way, it was definitely worth doing. Okay, I didn't film too much of the whole process, but basically intake manifolds kind of came off. We did the carbon cleaning, put new gaskets in, got a new thermostat down here, new water pump back here, new belt, new tensioner. So this was actually supposed to be for the supercharger, but apparently I bought the wrong one. So I figured throw a new one over here. I'll have to go ahead and order the supercharger tensioner that'll go down here. And then next up, I'm gonna throw the supercharger up top. Hopefully I routed everything okay. And in case you were wondering, I am an incredibly messy person. Got the new oil pan in. I just mounted up the oil level sensor. Next up, I'm gonna apply some gasket and then we will slap it onto the engine. Got the oil pan installed. During the gasket installation, the tube actually burst open in my hand. So I cut my thumb a little bit and made a huge mess. The tool showed up to pull off the brake booster from the brake pedal. So basically it kind of hooks in around here and releases some tabs. So you pull from the inside, pops that off. Made the job super easy, took a minute to do after an hour fighting. Anyway, I gotta clear out some of these leaves and then follow the wires that we need to disconnect. So all these kind of extra wires that run along here feed up into this gray plastic tray. The goal is to remove this tray and then get to the clutch master cylinder that's down below here. All that brake and clutch stuff popped out pretty easily once I got the master cylinder out of the way, disconnected all the lines, moved out this gray bucket, and then pulled out the clutch master cylinder. And I just went out to the Avant and double checked, and the whole pedal box assembly is going to match right up. It's got the hole in the firewall already for the clutch, so that should all go in pretty well. So what I'm going to do now is go inside and actually start studying up on some wiring so that I can figure out which wires need to transfer from the S4 and where they go into the Avant when we get to that point. Over on this side, we're going to let the oil pan gasket cure for 24 hours, and then that's going to get torqued fully. Then I'm going to just finish the last couple things up top. We've got to do spark plugs and coil packs. And I'm still waiting on the supercharger tensioner. Apparently that was a very difficult part to find, besides going to Audi and paying like $160 at the dealership for a tensioner. Alright, I'm going to wrap this up here. Thanks for following along. If you like what we're doing, feel free to subscribe or give us a thumbs up. We got a lot more parts coming in and a whole lot of stuff to install on the engine side of things. A couple more parts to pull out of the shell, and then maybe next video we'll actually start dragging this guy out and put the Avant in to start dismantling. So, thanks. On next week's video, we're gonna S4 swap a Tesla truck.